Welcome to Equity Is, a podcast from the School District of Philadelphia's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion's Equity Coalition. This podcast is about cultivating prosperity and liberation for students and staff. We do this by showcasing and debriefing on the great equity work that is being done throughout the School District of Philadelphia community. With each episode, we hope to cover topics that will create pathways for marginalized populations in our district by removing barriers, increasing access and inclusion, building trust, and creating a shared culture of social responsibility and organizational accountability. I am your host, Tori Potenza, the Program Manager for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Today, we are looking at one of the ways that equity is restorative here at the district. We are looking into relationships first, a restorative justice practice philosophy that emphasizes the importance of positive, authentic human connection and its link to both academic success and social emotional learning. The framework is built upon 3 tiers. Tier 1, community building circles and restorative conversations. Tier 2, harmony healing circles. Tier 3, welcome circles, and circles of support and accountability. The program has proven to be an effective alternative to suspension and other punitive forms of discipline. To begin our discussion on relationships first, we talked to Abby Gray and Josh Staub. Abby is the Deputy Chief for the Office of School, Climate, and Culture. Josh is the Director of Restorative Programming. Together, they brought relationships first to the district. So thank you all so much for joining us today. To kick us off, I would like to ask, could you provide a little context on how restorative justice practices came to the district and how relationships first fits into that?
Yeah, absolutely. Josh, take it away.
So I was a teacher previously in Baltimore, and then had a chance to go work in Oakland, California as a teacher in a high school. And the program that we were working with would be equivalent to like emotional support here in Philadelphia. And so one of the things that was happening at that time in Oakland was that restorative justice was coming into the schools. And so at one point, I got involved with these people because the work that I was doing in this program was very similar. I'd never heard of RJ before. And when I heard about it, I was like, well, I gotta learn more about this. And so, long story short, I got to be a restorative justice facilitator in Oakland for a number of years in an acceleration middle school. And, it was just fantastic. It was one of the best experiences that I've ever had in a school. And then so like my wife and I moved here to Philadelphia. I'm born and raised in Pennsylvania here. And I was working with Dr. Nunez when she was the assistant superintendent in Network 5 in Kensington. And so a number of those schools we were doing restorative justice, because for me, I was her, I guess what they called it at the time was an MTSS specialist. And we were really supposed to be basically the climate person for a network supporting climate initiatives. And for me, from my background, restorative justice to me was the answer to a lot of the issues that we were facing in schools. And so we tackled it there. And I think other schools from different networks, like the one Michelle used to work at, like Taylor in Network 11. So other places, they heard about what we were doing in Network 5 and they were interested in it. And so I spent some time, just sort of on my own, just going around to different schools and doing some trainings, a lot of one-off stuff, not a lot of coaching, nothing like that. One summer I got to meet these fantastic people from the University of Pennsylvania. And that's really where Abby comes in. And so, I'll turn it over to you, Abby, just to talk a little bit about sort of how we went from like just me out there to what it is now.
Sure. So the summer that I first met Josh, I was working as a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania at the Consortium for Policy Research and Education. And I am a mixed methods researcher by training. And one of the areas of research that I was really involved with was restorative alternatives to punitive discipline. So as part of my research and my work with the school district around sort of school climate and discipline, I met Josh. I would say we started kind of dreaming big about like what this work could be in the school district. At that time, I was a partner as a researcher, but I was not at the school district. But just a few months later, my predecessor, Jody Greenblatt, took another position. And I decided that was my time to come to the school district. And honestly, I say this to people, but it's really true. the work that Josh is doing is the work that I came here to support. It is the reason that I'm here. Not to say that there are many other wonderful things happening, in my opinion, in the Office of School Climate and Culture that I'm excited to be a part of, but this is what brought me here. So when I came as deputy very early on, Josh and I started talking about building a team around this. And so at the time, we had 0 staff for Relationships First, and that was 2.5 years ago. And now we have Josh as full-time director. We have a lead Relationships First coach, and we have how many coaches altogether?
There's 13 coaches and 2 interns at this point.
Full-time. So we have a large and growing team, and now we have created Relationships First as the established restorative practices program in the school district. And that's based on really, our Relationships First was designed to address the shortcomings that other restorative practices models have demonstrated, not only in our district, but in national research. So this is our own version, the school district's own version. It is based, as Josh can tell you, on the Oakland unified version of restorative justice. But we have found that it works better in our schools than other approaches that our district has tried. And so I'm just excited. Like, my role at this point is I just try to move stuff out of Josh's and his team's way and set things up for them to do their work.
Could you describe some more about your restorative justice work and some of the importance and impact that you feel like it's had on school communities?
So, basically, when we talk about restorative justice, we're always talking about Indigenous work. We're talking about something that's very old. The Maori work is going to get us into probably a later conversation, around how this fits with equity and how this fits with battling school to prison pipeline. But that's sort of where we're grounded in this idea that if we have strong community support, we can handle most of our issues in a community. In fact, we can handle all of our issues in our community. We don't need to farm it out to systems that may not have our best interest. And so that's how this was brought into schools originally in Oakland. It was sort of this idea that if we had these alternatives to suspension, alternatives to punitive discipline, then we could keep kids in our building and we wouldn't feed them to a school to prison pipeline. And I think what was genius about what happened in Oakland was that the folks, so people like Fania Davis, who's a big part of this, David Usum, who's born and raised in Philly, and he's the director out there, their mentality was, yes, alternatives to suspension, these have to be in place, but to do that well, we need to build community. And so there was a huge emphasis in their model around community building. So preventative work, what we would call MTSS Tier 1. And they even, in this, you got to remember, this is over a decade ago when no one was doing this. They aligned their RJ work to MTSS framework. And so there's 3 tiers to this. And so for me, when I was coming in the RJ, I was coming in from administration. And these folks spoke my language. And as a teacher, I could also relate because they were speaking teacher language. And the emphasis was on Tier 1, community building, restorative conversations. And so that's where we begin here with schools. Our version of restorative justice is identical to OUSD's in that it's aligned to the 3 tiers with a huge emphasis on community building, Tier 1. And what I can see from this year, most of our RF schools, and we have about 55 of them right now that are working on Tier 1. Most of them have done a good job of implementing something like a community meeting or a community building circle. And from that, you can see even the classrooms and the schools that do it well have markedly different outcomes, and not just in keeping kids in buildings or lowering referrals, which is great, but also it impacts academics because we're talking now about more quality instruction time, less time chewed up by escalation or power struggle or et cetera. So it has that impact as well. And so I always like to, bring in this tie-in and say, we're not just climate work, even though we sit in the Office of Climate and Culture, we're also supporting academics directly.
Yeah, and seeing those connections is so important too, and how all of these initiatives connect in that way. One thing I always found interesting about restorative justice, and I remember going to a criminal justice conference in Dallas several years ago, and someone was talking about restorative justice on a global scale and how to apply RJ work to the whole country and healing in that way. And so I'm interested, because my thoughts on restorative justice were always much smaller than that. It is about 2 people connecting or a community connecting. So how do you look at it both in that micro and macro sense, since we do have such a big school district?
I mean, I think that's the genius behind the MTSS framework. The MTSS framework is asking us to think on three levels. It's asking us to think about the entire school community. So, on like a macro level. And then it's asking us to think about small groups, like small group interventions, whether it's academic or whether it's, a mediation, like, harmony healing circle. But then it's also saying like, we have people that need individual attention. And we call those kids extra love kids. We also know there's extra love adults. We need more. And so framing restorative justice, sending basically that philosophy through the framework of MTSS, which was done over in Oakland. I just think it's brilliant. David Usum and Fania and Barbara McLuhan, who was over there, just brilliant stuff. And I think that's how you answer that question.
Now, I want to talk a little bit more about specifically relationships first. Could you describe a little bit of how that worked in your schools where it's implemented?
So with relationships first, we basically, our goal really, because we have these great coaches, and what we want to do is we want to transfer their skills. So all the stuff that they know. And so we meet it as a team every Tuesday. So we have professional development basically every week for 3 hours. And so these folks are very skilled. And we want to make sure that folks at the school site have what they have. And so the way we do this is typically the first step is meeting with whoever's leading in the school. So their leadership team, talking about what this thing is so that folks understand this is a 3-tiered process. There is, 3 different layers to this. We're going to begin with tier 1 and work our way up to tier 3. And then really what we want to do is we want to identify a group of adults at that school, and it could be even student leaders are a part of it at some schools, parents are part of it. It's in thinking outside the box, because some schools, school police help lead this work. It could be someone from the cafeteria, whatever. We include a lot of different people, but we want to basically identify a group of adults who are going to become the champions of this work. And, we call it like a care team or an RF team, whatever we want to call it. And then they get a lot of support from the coach, very direct support. And then with the full community of teachers and staff members, we want to train everybody in tier 1. So teachers get trained in how to lead community building circles, and they get trained on how to have restorative conversations, which is disciplinary. And everyone does. And so in an ideal world, that RF team or that care team, along with their coach, would train everybody else. And not just train like, here's a PD day, but the way we coach is through what we call like a model mentor transfer. It's, I taught for a long time and I use a gradual release method. So it's very common for like a coach to come in and model a lot of practices. So they'll lead a circle. And then the next step would be, maybe like a week later or 2 weeks later, the coach and the teacher co-lead, or the RF team member and the teacher co-lead a circle. And then the next step would be the teacher leads the circle without anybody. And then maybe the coach is like in circle just as a secondary support, and eventually fades out to transfer the skill. And then tier 1, as we move through the tiers, so we're going to move eventually from tier 1, which is like everybody getting trained in community building circles that happen once a week, to restorative conversations that happen all the time and prevent referrals. Now we're going to move into tier 2 at some point. But first, there's this work we call equity liberation work that we do in circle. And all of it's related to equity work. And that's something that happens in a building through circle. And then we'll get into the tier 2, which is like small group, which is mediation. It could be youth led. Tier 1 can be youth led. Typically we train discipline teams in tier 2. And then tier 3 are like individual supports. So we have 2 things: welcome circle, circle of support and accountability. And again, we train leadership team, we train RF team, care team, and we work through those 3 tiers. Now I'd say there's only one school right now that does like all 3 tiers as part of like their own in-house practice. And that's the school that Michelle used to work at, Taylor. And then other schools, there are some that are also doing tier 2 stuff, tier 3 stuff, which is great. But most schools are still in tier 1 mode, which is essential.
What's the impacts you've all seen so far on implementing these programs?
So really, I mean, this is the first year of RF. This is year 1 during all this COVID stuff. So I can talk a little bit about that. So before RF, when we were just doing restorative justice and it was just me, I was at a handful of schools. And one of the schools that really stuck out was Juniata Park Academy. That was one of our Network 5 schools. It was our biggest school, like 1,200 kids up in North Philly. And their assistant principal was trained previously by another group and loved it. But, he needed more. He needed it refined in some regard. And that was using the MTSS piece. he brought in the two deans who are just incredible people. And the three of them formed like what we would call an RF team today. And they did some amazing things tier one. But what I really want to highlight with them is that the tier two work is called a harmony healing circle, and it's a form of mediation. And basically, we know that our harmony healing circles are successful if, one, we reach agreements in those space, and two, they're never broken. And most of these cases, they're like alternatives to suspension. So basically, it's saying to two kids who had some kind of disagreement or a fight, like option number one would be like a 3-day suspension, for instance. Or option number two is a harmony healing circle. And if you choose that route, you have to reach agreements and they can't be broken. So you're giving folks a way out of the punitive side, but you're not taking the punitive side away. You're just saying, well, which path do you want? I hope you take the second one. And so they did close to 200. They did 182 of these the year before COVID. And every one of them was successful, every one of them, which meant out of 182 harmony healing circles, every one of them reached agreements that were never broken the whole year. And that's normal. It's very normal. It's unusual to have agreements broken. And so I think I've personally done around a little over 2,000 of these circles. And I can probably count on two hands the times when agreements have been broken. So that's just sort of like one testament. These are very successful in terms of alternatives to suspension. But from the community building side, I think what you see is, you can see the schools that invest in this from that side of it. And you have a markedly different school than schools around it, for instance. And climate-wise, it shows in terms of like referrals, less referrals, or like less suspensions. Like one of our RF schools in West Philly had its first suspension this year, a couple weeks ago, and they're deep in this work. So those kind of things that we expect to see. I'm really excited because I think moving into next year, you're going to see that even more. Hopefully less disruption from COVID. We're going to be able to work with folks over the summer as well.
I think another thing that is really exciting to see in the schools is the extent of youth leadership and ownership. Josh's team this year has trained, I don't know how many students, but it's a lot. And we see really exciting things happening. Like right now, we have an event that's in the planning stages for next week where youth leaders from a high school who've been trained in relationships first are going to get on a bus and go over to one of the elementary schools that's also implementing relationships first and hold circles with the kids in the elementary school. And we're seeing that kind of youth leadership, not just there, but in lots of places. I mean, Josh can say more about it than I can, but the connections that our coaches are building with students, and the connections, more importantly, that they're helping staff build with the students, are really a powerful thing. I think that's a really wonderful impact of this program.
Yeah, I mean, what I'll highlight is, so we have a group from Ben Rush that's going to be next Tuesday. Basically, we're taking over the whole school. The kids are pushing into all the classrooms, and they're leading circles, and they're leading like social emotional learning activities the whole day. Well, most of the day until 1:30. And so then, like Abby's saying, they're going to go to Blaine, where they have some youth leaders as well. South Philly High, they have brilliant youth leaders down there right now that are young, and they're going to be taking over this work. That's the dream of this work, is that with implementation comes turning this over to the youth, and it comes through like a myriad of ways. Like at Kappa, there's different groups. Like we have specifically a group that supports LGBTQ trans youth. We have a Black male group. We have a Latinx group. So we have affinity groups that way. That's one way we roll. Another way is through like student government. Like I know South Philly High, they have a lot of their extra love kids are also now circle keepers, and their student government's being trained in the next couple of weeks. So ideally, we're going to see in the next 2 years with this work, more and more schools, more and more RF, RJ work being taken over by the youth at the schools. And like, we can just be the elders who help maintain it. That's part of implementation.
I feel like that's just also inspiring to hear, even just for the little bit we've been talking. So I can only imagine what actually seeing some of this is like, especially in the schools. I would love to see some of this. This is a question that came from someone on our podcast team who actually is in one of the schools and has talked very highly of the program. But she asked specifically regarding race, how have healing and harming circles been a positive way to establish a culture of anti-racism throughout various schools in our district?
I mean, I would even dial it back to like the community building side, really, because where you're really going to have these robust conversations. Well, first, that's one piece, right? Having like a conversation, being able to talk about race just openly with your peers and just discuss it, and having a talking piece, which means you have equity of voice, and having guidelines that keep it safe. So that's like one side of it. But the other side of it is intentionally building community. It prevents a lot of harm, whatever guise it takes. If it's going to come through that guise, or whether it's just fighting or whatever it is. So taking that time, and then when harm is done, regardless of, again, this, the source of the harm or the medium through which it occurs, we have options. If it's mutual, we can go the mediation route. We can use a harm healing circle. We don't have to be punitive. And then that's going to involve both parties being prepped, which is going to involve like an extensive restorative conversation, which means they're going to be sitting with someone who's going to have them going through some kind of like rigorous self-reflection, prepping them for a mediation. So that has its benefits. Most instances of racism that I've dealt with here in Philly, even in Oakland or Baltimore, most of it is related to some kind of like implicit bias. Most of it. It's very rare that I'll come across a situation where it's just like someone's just explicitly racist, unapologetically explicitly racist. It's happened, but it's like super rare. So in the other case, how do you combat some kind of implicit bias? Well, sort of conversation will help you interrogate that. But so will intentionally building community, through a community building circle. It'll lessen these things from happening. And once you have trust, so if I've been doing circle work with a group of youth, by this time in the year, we can talk about anything. We have the trust built in the room. When I was doing this work in Oakland, this was back when Donald Trump was elected president. And like most of my kids are coming out of Mexico and Guatemala, and a significant amount of my students had undocumented fathers or mothers. And all these things that were happening were very racially charged. We had a space where we could bring that in. And sometimes it was very intentional, because something would happen that would be like big. Trayvon Martin, when he was murdered, like these kind of things. Like I had a student shot in the face by a police officer. Things like this we can bring in, whether it affects our youth or whether it affects us like globally in this work. Community building circles are powerful, because one of the questions that you ask, and one of the first questions that you come to after you go over the guidelines, is what's important to you today. So I may roll into circle, and I led circle this morning at John Welsh, and I have no idea where people are at when they come to me in that space. If we've established a safe space and I ask that question, what's important to you today, you can bring in anything as long as it's respectful. And so that's where you really, you get to hear what's on kids' minds, adults' minds around race. That all this year, it's been a theme when I've asked that question. At least several members of the community will bring up something around Black Lives Matter. It's important to them. They'll talk about why, or other things that are related. And so there's so many avenues into the equity work, into justice work, or into anti-racism work through restorative justice. And I guess the last thing I'll say about this is like, we're rooted in civil rights. The folks that founded restorative justice, this is all happening concurrent with civil rights. I mean, the godmother of this work is Fania Davis and her sister Angela Davis. That's really where we're getting sort of the heart to this work, besides the indigenous side. So, we're rooted in this. Without the justice work, we don't exist.
Yeah, that's so important to acknowledge. So to end our conversation today, I feel like I could talk about this for a while, but I would love to know where Relationships First is available, as well as how schools that are interested in implementing something like this could go about that.
So it's very simple for schools. So right now they're engaged in their school planning, and they're going to be asked to choose what they're going to do for next year, academic and in climate. Schools can choose to select Relationships First. And that's how the schools that we work with now have gotten to us. What that'll trigger for us is, once we know what schools are going to be doing this next year with us, in addition to what we're already doing, we'll then be assigning coaches and going that route. And so it's just as simple as indicating it in their school plans.
To deepen our understanding of Relationships First, we decided to look into one of the schools that uses the program, Taylor Elementary. Taylor Elementary is located in the Huntington Park neighborhood of Philadelphia. The school has fully implemented all tiers of the Relationships First program. We sat down with David Laver, Taylor's principal, Nicole Molino, a Relationships First coach, as well as Mason, a student at Taylor. They each gave us their perspective on how the program has affected their school. Thank you all so much for being here and taking the time to talk to me today. My first question is for David. I wanted to ask if you could just tell us a little bit about the restorative justice journey at Taylor Elementary.
Okay, sure. Well, thanks for being here. It's one of our favorite topics to talk about, relationships first at Taylor. So it was actually a very natural progression because this is now my 8th year at Taylor, and a lot of the staff have been here either as long or longer or almost as long. And there are many of us here on staff that come to education with a background of wanting to build community, of wanting to teach the whole child, including their emotional side and their spiritual side, wanting to obviously reduce suspensions and keep kids in school. So for many years, we've been working to build community and have classroom meetings and have fun events and work with students in a way that treats them with respect and dignity and hopefully builds up our school climate and culture in a positive way. So that's work we've been doing for quite some time here at Taylor. But then when Josh came along and the Relationships First program, it was just such a natural fit, and we were able to take it to the next level with Josh's support. And I think we were doing a decent job, although we didn't call it this, of our tier 1 interventions and our tier 1 supports. But with Josh's help, we've taken that to the next level in terms of classroom meetings and also going on to support our students when they're having conflict, when they're having troubles, and just helping them resolve kind of those interpersonal struggles that all of us have sometimes in ways that are restorative and productive and not solely disciplinary in nature. So it's been an amazing kind of journey, and we're really just grateful to Josh and his whole team.
And Nicole, so you work at Taylor as one of the Relationships First coaches. Could you describe what your role is like and what a typical day at Taylor looks like for you?
Sure. So my daily work emphasizes community building, building trust, obviously building relationships, and that's all aimed at strengthening our school community as well as offering restorative interventions that are aimed at repairing harm and providing support to our extra love students or our students that need the most support. So a typical day could look like, on the tier 1 level, supporting teachers in implementation of tier 1 community building circles. If we have a new student in our school community, engaging in welcome circles to get them oriented, feeling safe, comfortable, welcomed. Similarly, if a student is leaving our school community, they're part of our community forever. So giving them that proper goodbye circle and closing the loop for ourselves as well and saying goodbye to our friends and with, how lucky the new school is to have them. So that's kind of the tier 1. Restorative conversations are kind of in there as tier 1. Tier 2, it would be more restorative mediation through harm and healing circles, re-entry circles. So if there is a situation in which it's a super egregious situation, or if a child has broken an agreement in a harm and healing circle, then there are consequences. And we have re-entry circles in which the child, their families, their teacher, anybody they feel they have a relationship with at the school, we circle up and we think of a goal together, how we're going to be successful. And it's just like a circle of accountability and support really for that student re-entering our school environment the next day after a punitive consequence. And then sometimes it may look like at a tier 1 level, just heading down to lunch, checking in on kids and seeing how they're doing and saying, oh, you look like you could hang out with a new friend today. So why don't we connect you with someone new that you haven't talked to before? And so building those relationships.
Being able to have Ms. Molino fully released this year is really a big part of what's helping us take this to the next level. So Ms. Molino was a 3rd grade classroom teacher for 10 years? 11 years. And one of her areas of expertise was building community in the classroom and implementing lots of these restorative justice strategies. So when some extra funding came through with the ARPA funding, it was a no-brainer for us if we could create one more position on staff. And we met as a leadership team, and there was near unanimous consent that this was really an important position. And so we're just really grateful that those funds have become available. And our hope is that over the next couple of years, other schools and the powers that be in the district can really see that it can just change a school climate for the better.
Mason, I would love to ask you, since getting Miss Molino as the Relationships First coach this year, what changes have you noticed?
I've noticed that kids can play together more without being harmful and have a safer learning environment. In the classroom, they don't have to have conflict with somebody. They could have a friendship or at least a relationship that's decently upheld by both of the kids in that situation. I've noticed that there's a lot of kids who's been happier and you could speak their mind more. The kid gets into an argument with another student that they actually like or friends with. She could help both of the kids form a circle and get back together and be friends again by her just helping us starting a circle up. And it doesn't necessarily have to be one student and another student. It could be like multiple students not liking each other at all. And she doesn't force you to be friends with the other student you were with and had conflict with. She said just try not to be rude to each other, have a relationship, and just be all together next to each other.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's really great to hear. Could you tell me a little bit more about how it's changed things for you personally?
Okay, so me and another student, we got into a lot of arguments, and we just didn't really like each other too much. Until one day, like it got really heated and we were about to start fighting each other. We were screaming at each other. And then the teacher at that time sent me down to the office to calm down. And then she set up a circle with me and him so we could both feel better. We could have more fun. We could at least know a little about each other. Doing this entire thing, it could really affect somebody. Like imagine being in their shoes and just seeing like how I would feel when what's going on in their life happened to me. We made agreements and we weren't like best of friends, but we actually liked each other. It's not like we were always in a conflict. We just understood each other, and that's that.
Thank you so much for sharing that personal story, Mason. David, you could tell us about some of the major changes that you've noticed since implementing Relationships First at your school.
Well, there's been quite a few. I mean, I'll echo what Mason said about students seeming just happier in general. I mean, part of that I think is coming back after the pandemic and being here in person. But the students are feeling much more comfortable knowing that they have staff, Ms. Molino and others, who have been trained in Relationships First, and that there are many adults who they can go to help them resolve conflicts before putting their fists up and getting into a physical confrontation, which may have happened more quickly in the past. So that's a definite change. Our lunch and recess, while I think it's always been great and a lot of fun at Taylor, it's just even more fun now. And because there's a lot less conflict during recess, the kids are playing better together. And also in the classrooms, every single teacher is working really hard to have a daily morning meeting and a weekly circle that's a little bit deeper. And that has just, I think, done wonders to creating individual classroom communities where obviously we're not always harmonious, but when there isn't harmony, that there are tools at children's disposal to kind of work out the differences and work out the strife within the classroom, either on their own or with the teacher's help. It's kind of made just a big difference in the culture of the school in general, about people feeling safe and comfortable and happy to be here.
And Nicole, you had touched on this a little bit about consequences. So could you talk a little bit more about what Relationships First accountability and consequences look like?
Sure. So I think first we tried to be more proactive. So being proactive and restorative is we're using those restorative conversations, and they're used as an alternative to an ODR or a pink slip. And when they're really done with integrity and everybody is on board with it, they dramatically will decrease pink slips or ODRs. So with that being said, when there are super egregious situations, which they do arise, we are not a school where we don't have consequences. We absolutely have consequences because consequences teach people and students a lesson sometimes. And they put boundaries up, and that's important for kids. So we, as a team, depending on the situation, we think of a natural consequence for that particular student, that particular situation. I had mentioned earlier about a reentry circle. So that's always going to follow up with a reentry circle, which is a very restorative process in which you're having the family sit down, coming up with goals. How can we make sure this doesn't happen again? And everybody's walking away from the table with an action item, if you will. Also, with the harm and healing circles, Mason had mentioned that there's these agreements that are made, and the students that's on them. They come up with these agreements, things they need to move forward in peace with their peer. And they know that if they need support, they're about to break that agreement, they would come to me and I'm going to help them through it. And if they know that if they don't come to me, then it goes to the route of our care team here, and there's going to be a consequence, right? Because we've already circled up in a restorative way. You've done that thing that we've healed from and it's happened again. Now there's a consequence that's behind that. So I would say a broken agreement equals a consequence. A super egregious situation, that's going to also equal consequence. Everything's going to be followed up with a reentry restorative circle, though, with the family and all the stakeholders involved in that student's education.
And I'll just add real quickly that because of all this, it's really helped us to reduce our out of school suspensions, because that's really become, the last resort. Now, we've had a couple of suspensions this year, so we're not at 100% of students with 0 out of school suspensions, but we're at over 99. But because we first circle up and they make agreements and they try to make things right and fix what harm they've caused, if they can hold up to their agreements, well, then we can all move forward peacefully and those consequences wouldn't be needed. So sometimes, though, students break those agreements and there might be a consequence. And then the other thing is we're now much more inclined to keep students for an in-school suspension if a suspension is indeed warranted, so that we could spend time with that student during the day processing, having them do their schoolwork, but also reflecting on what happened and what led to this consequence, and hopefully move forward in a much more productive manner.
Mason, could you tell me, what do you like about having relationships first at your school?
The fact that problems have decreased a lot. If you're outside and you have a problem with somebody, you can go to Miss Molino and she'll probably solve it either with the circle or any other way. Things get bad enough to the point where you would have to leave and you would have to not be around that student anymore. Then that's when you could get Miss Molino to try and make you guys friends again, or just set up a circle. Miss Molino, and not just Miss Molino, but a whole bunch of different teachers teach you you can deal with this problem by doing this, waiting your turn, acting politely to do that. There's a whole bunch of things. And also most teachers adapt to which student can play with these students, which students can talk to each other in an unmannered way. The teachers in the school, they adapt pretty well. Sometimes it's just not easy to say sorry and get somebody else to say sorry. It's one word that's very hard to say because people get defensive. And if it's a situation where you have to say sorry, you can tell when somebody does not mean it sorry. And when somebody's actually passionate about being sorry and wants to be friends. And if you're actually genuinely sorry about something, you can tell when you're sorry about it. And then you can try and end a conflict by saying sorry.
Thank you so much. You brought up so many great points there. Even just sometimes it's not easy to say sorry is so important to remember. Now, I have this question for Nicole, but David, I'd love to hear it if you want to answer as well. Could you describe a moment that really solidified the impact of this work?
Well, I would say there's a lot of little moments, but this one in particular really brought a big smile to my face. There's a student that I have been working with, particularly in the lunch hours, just really trying to focus on getting this child to build some relationships, some positive relationships at school. We'd sit at lunch and he would share with me that he has this enemy, and there's been several times where we have had to circle up through the course of the school year with this particular student, squashing different situations that have come up between the two of them. So this teacher texts me and she says, I gotta tell you something that this student just told me. He said to her, if it weren't for Miss Molino, then me and this student would be enemies right now. And we're not, we're friends. For me, that just sent a bigger message that this child feels safe coming to school. And ultimately that's going to affect his learning, right? So the learning outcomes are going to go up because he's feeling like he wants to be at school. He feels like he's supported and he is got a friend or maybe not an enemy right now. So I thought that was a great little nugget. And you don't hear all these little nuggets. And I was really grateful that my colleague shared that with me.
So I'll add that for me, and I've shared this with folks here at Taylor, every morning from 8:30 to 9 before the first bell, when school starts at 9 o'clock, every morning from 8:30 to 9, we have recess on the playground for our 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders before school starts. It's really my favorite part of the day every day because the kids are so happy to be at school. They're feeling a sense of belonging and happiness of being at Taylor. They have friendships here at Taylor. They know that they have adults that really care about them. And the fact that we can have a 30-minute recess before the school day starts, really not all that many adults supervising, but there's certainly some of us there. And most mornings, there's rarely any kind of interpersonal conflicts amongst the students at all. They're just playing and having a good time. And it just is a great way for them to start their day, get that energy out and to be having fun and to just be feeling happy about being in school. And then when their teacher comes down at 9 o'clock to pick up, they're ready to go for the day. And so really every day between 8:30 and 9, I just feel really grateful that we've had the team in place here and Josh's support. And we've been just working hard year after year to create a relationships first environment. We're just very proud of that at this point.
It's great to hear all of these different perspectives and hear all these personal stories as well. Before we wrap up, I just have one final question that I'd like to ask of all of you, if you have a brief answer. What would you like people to know about relationships first?
Even before, whether it was Josh or Dr. Gray, decided on the term relationships first. And I'm so glad that they chose those words because really, in my opinion, any educator who is really serious about having positive outcomes for students is going to always have a mindset that relationships come first. Students are not going to be excelling academically or in other ways if they're not feeling safe and secure and in an environment where they have lots of wonderful relationships with both adults and children. So I guess I would say that relationships first is obviously crucial to any school environment. And the way the supports Josh and his team have put together, including guidelines around how to do the circles, how to do the community meetings, how to do the harm and healing circles, how to build community at the school level. All those tools are right there for any school leadership team to embrace. And, I think the proof is in the pudding, so to speak. And when folks come to Taylor, they can really sense that students are just really happy and comfortable and feeling safe. And then our test scores are just coming along right with that. So I feel like it's an invaluable part of any school.
It creates a safer, happier learning environment, and it just makes me feel like I have people who I can trust here, and no matter where I am, I can, like, whether I'm in the classroom, I'm at recess, I'm in the lunchroom, I just feel like there's somebody I can talk to and somebody I can have there to let me know just check on me to let me know if I'm all right.
Mr. Laver kind of took it. The proof is in the pudding. I think that our kids are very happy. I think it feels good to be here. They feel good. We as staff, so another layer of this is, that restorative piece, that tier 1. We do a lot of staff circles, and I think our staff feel good about being at this school and happy to be working at Taylor. So I just, if you have to consider if this is a position at your school, And I think it works beautifully if you're able to afford at a school a dean and a relationships first coach. I think that's a perfect marriage.
It was really lovely to talk to you all. David, Nicole, Mason, thank you for taking the time to talk about your school and relationships first.
So that wraps up our dive into the Relationships First program. We want to thank everyone that took the time to sit down and talk to us and help us understand a little bit more about how this program works. If you are interested in learning more about the program, you can visit philasd.org. You can also check the show notes for the link. Thank you for listening to this episode of Equity Is. We will be back next month to explore another program here at the School District of Philadelphia. To stay up to date with what's going on in the DEI office, visit philasd.org/DEI/. You can find more episodes of Equity Is on iTunes, Spotify, and the DEI YouTube page. Make sure to check the show notes for more information from this episode, as well as updates about what's going on in our office. Take care.